So as Tony mentioned, we chose this together this title for the conference, Surprise and Emotion with a question mark. And one of my where is it? Here? Yes. So my title will actually go through 3 different points. The first one will be, sorry, I need to go here as well. Yes. So the first step will go into this whole background of the conference, surprise, emotion, just in order to give a framework for the this connection between surprise and emotion, and to question this maybe the obviousness, the first obviousness of the link between surprise and emotion. And then, I chose to introduce another term or concept, valence, to go deeper into this connection between surprise and emotion, to try to focus a bit more on what is at work in this relationship. And the third and final step, which I will only sketch here, is this opening to what I called cardio-phenomenology. So it's directly linked to this interdisciplinary project we have in Paris within this research ANR, Agence Nationale de la Recherche. And so, and therefore we have colleagues from psychophysiology working with her, Thomas and Bruno here, and also colleagues from linguistic, Agnès and Pascal. And this is already a multidisciplinary work, and therefore with this issue of cardio-phenomenology, the idea is to sketch the connections with neuro and psychophysiology. So Thomas especially will develop this scientific aspect further on Friday. But I will try to sketch the framework, the general philosophical framework for it today already. So first, sorry, I need to. Yes. So my first step will go into these different aspects. So the first aspect is just to review this idea, this well-known idea, as surprise as being a primary emotion among others. So the idea that surprise belongs to emotion as a generic issue and fits into it actually. So that was especially developed by some psychologists and earlier on some philosophers as well. So I will just review that in order to give a first aspect of the connection. And then I will go into phenomenologies very quickly, some founding phenomenologies of emotion with this question. Which is also a way to question the obviousness of the first stance, which is at work in the psychological work, the previous psychological work. Does lived surprise belong to affective acts? So I will go into this questioning of the connection between surprise and emotion through this step. And third, I will try to sketch a possible, not an answer, but a possible way to resolve the difficulty with the idea of a plurivectorial dynamic of surprise, what I call this way. So with the idea that surprise involves an emotional component, but results actually a more encompassing circular phenomenon. So that will be my first step, just to put the framework, to try to put the framework of the whole issue. So first, surprise as a primitive crucial affection. So first, if you look at some significant philosophers, especially here Descartes and Kant, you find Descartes is well known as his patience of soul for developing an understanding of surprise through admiration. And if you, well, I just quoted two very tiny extracts from the Patience of Soul. Lors que la première rencontre de quelque objet nous surprend, que nous le jugeons être nouveau, fort différent de ce que nous connaissions auparavant, ou bien que nous le supposions qu'il devait être, cela fait que nous l'admirons. And then a bit further on, he says, l'admiration est une subite surprise de l'âme, that's the famous sentence, qui fait qu'elle se porte à considérer avec attention les objets qui lui semblent rares et extraordinaires. So in these very small passages, we see how Descartes situates surprise as one of the 6 primitive passions. That's very well known. At the first of the 6 primitive passions, so it gives him really a primacy. It gives it a primacy, and it's also for him a passion that has no contrary, no opposite, contrary to others: joy, sadness, or love, hate, desire being also without any opposite. But so there is already a primacy of surprise, even if it is analyzed by Descartes through admiration, which it would need a whole study to understand why he goes to surprise through admiration. So I won't go into it now, but my point here is just to mention this primacy in a list of 6 primitive passions. And in another way, very in a smaller passage in Kant, in the Anthropologie in pragmatischer Hinsicht, in a late work of Kant's work, surprise is very soberly defined as well, through affect. Actually is defined as Überraschung durch Empfindung. So it gives surprise a very important role because it defines the very sudden reality of affect. So here surprise is really what enables Kant to identify affect. And to identify it as opposed to passion, Leidenschaft, according to the temporality of the 2 phenomena. Whereas passion for Leidenschaft, which involves duration, something that will evolve in time, affect is a very sudden phenomenon. So there is a common point between Descartes here and Kant, the suddenness of surprise, so the temporal very quickness of surprise, and also the primacy. I mean the primacy of this affection, let's say. For psychologists now, that's also very well known. Ekman and Friesen in 71 first, and then Plutchik. There are other psychologists that could be evoked here as well, but I chose these 2 ones because they are very pregnant in this issue. So they both insist of this basic character of emotion, surprise as a basic emotion, but also among others, among other emotions. So they belong to a list or a set of other emotions, and they're for Ekman universal among these 6 basic emotions: anger, fear, surprise, disgust, sadness, and enjoyment. So we find some emotion that was already present present in Descartes' patient. There is a kind of mapping, not partial mapping between both. And Plutchik later developed what is very well known as well as the wheel of emotions, so 8 basic emotions, surprise being one of these 8 emotions, and also 8 advanced ones, more complex one, which results as a composition or a combination of these basic first 8 basic ones. So, so here again, surprise seems to be very obviously an emotion. I mean, that's kind of obviousness. So, just to develop a bit Ekman's and Friesen perspective, surprise is understood by these psychologists as an adaptive physiological function with a very sensory motor sensory criterion of increased visual field from widened eyes. The expressive aspect is not so developed by the psychologists. I mean, they wonder if there is really a communicative function in this surprise emotion. And one aspect that I just leave, but I won't develop, but which is interesting in these psychologists' account, is the difficulty they mentioned to distinguish between fear and surprise for some of the subjects they interviewed. So this the universality is a bit limited by this difficulty, we could say. And now Plutchik, where we also have an integration of surprise into this framework of different emotions. So basic emotions with four main ones among surprise: joy, trust, fear, and surprise. And then there is this dynamic in Plutchik between basic emotions and basic opposite emotions. And here what's interesting is surprise is opposed to anticipation, but not as a contrary emotion, not as something that would be a negation of a surprise. It's more a dynamic between both emotions, which is here at work. And in this issue, Plutchik is a very insists a lot on the coupling, the dynamic coupling between surprise and anticipation. So they're not. It's not a narrow opposition between both, but it creates associations with then other kinds of emotion. For example, anxiety will be the combination between fear and surprise, or disappointment will be the result of surprise and sadness. So, well, it's of course it's a dynamic model in a sense. So it's not like Ekman or Descartes earlier. It's not a linear list of emotions which are opposed one to the other in a kind of formal way. So it's just it's more the process of showing how an emotion is becoming an experience through the process of. So, for example, I will come back to this issue, surprise and sadness being actually something that has to do with disappointment. So I won't go further into this issue because I know Bruno is going to develop this further this afternoon. So, but it's for me just a way to sketch a general framework. And so this will be developed further by Bruno, so I won't go into that. But what you see here in this wheel of emotions, which is quite well known now, is actually it's a three-dimensional model. You also have here it was 2-dimensioned, but actually it's a wheel, so it's three-dimensional. And you have here, you may see the contrast and the dynamic between surprise and anticipation. So it's very important. I will come back to this because it's very important. it has a interesting resonances with what we found in the psychophysiological model, and also in the speculative hypothesis I had about surprise as a temporally embedded dynamic, and not as a just sudden punctual moment, the shock. I mean, sometimes surprise is, if you come back to Descartes, surprise is a sudden moment. So you could think that it's temporarily very tiny. But what we're exploring now in this project is finding out the dynamic of the phenomenon. So the way how anticipation or pretension, in a more precise Husserlian meaning, pretension is innerly linked to this suddenness. So there is a dynamic between both aspects. And it's interesting to see how Plutchik actually saw that in his own way without any, I mean, there is no direct connection with what we did or tried to explore. You have a question?
You could tell us where surprise is on the wheel.
Yeah, it's difficult to see. It's here. Actually, it's here.
I see it.
Whoop. Oh. It's here. And anticipation is here. So there is this is disgust, for example, is basic emotion, and trust would be the opposite, but in the sense of an articulation between both. This articulation bringing another more complex emotion if you link both, and you would have it's not so clear here, fear here, and I can't read it myself. Anger. So it's a very complex model. It would need a whole talk actually to.
But what are we supposed to get out of this? I still don't get it. What's the opposite of surprise?
Anticipation.
The opposite side is anticipation.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And if you look at the model in a kind of sphere, which is also a way to present it, Plutchik also presented it as a sphere, then the opposition is resolved actually because it's a dynamic, so it's a systemic model.
So what is anticipation? Because I could anticipate something and then be surprised when it doesn't happen. I mean, doesn't surprise presuppose disappointed anticipation? It's a way
it's one way to see it. Actually, it can be then a deception or disappointment, or it can be something that brings satisfaction because it occurs. I mean, that's already what I will develop. That it's I mean, it's a correlated emotional content of the dynamic, which can be either negative or positive, depending of the phenomenon or what happens. But the idea is to try to find out, to describe this process and the link, the inner link between surprise and anticipation. And the fact, anticipation not necessarily in a conscious way, in a pre-conscious way. And therefore, pretension is interesting in this issue because it's something that has to do with a very primitive tension, or something that is quite organic or pre-conscious and not voluntary, willful. And so you have, the idea is to, actually I could say that this way, surprise is experientially conditioned by an implicit anticipation. There won't be any surprise without anticipation. So it seems to be, it might be...
but then it seems very odd to call them opposites, doesn't it?
Sorry?
Then it seems very odd to call them opposites.
Yes, and that's why, I mean, Plutchik, yeah, I understand. When I discovered this in Plutchik, first I thought, well, they're not opposite, of course. For me, it was exactly what you said. But then I understood that his model is a circular one. So when he put them as opposites, actually for him, it's within a dynamic which correlates them. So the opposition actually is a correlation. So it's the way he formulates it. I think the phenomenology of it's more complex, it's more interesting. But it was interesting for me to see that he, in his own field, had seen this connection, which was not obvious, actually. And so it was quite interesting for me to see that there was a hint here at something that we, on our own way, had discovered or were trying to explore. I'll try to say a bit more about that. So now the second sub-point, so it has to do with, given this obviousness of the link between surprise and emotion, or the kind of taken for grantedness of these two notions, it's interesting to see how in some important phenomenologies of emotions, we have a quasi-absence of surprise as a theme. So it's a big contrast with what was set by psychologists or first classical philosophers. So I will go very quickly into some contrasted views in Husserl, Schiller, Heidegger and Sartre on this issue, and then maybe what can result from these very quick investigation, surprise as something that has to do with the nosological, ontological effect, and also some confirmations we may have from ancient and modern philosophers on this issue. So Husserl, to begin with, we find in Husserl very quickly, very synthetic, some unexpected places, I would say, of surprise in something that is not a very a full-fledged phenomenology of emotion. We don't have that in Husserl, but there are still at different levels of Husserl's analysis, some indirect entry into affective acts, and some way to catch surprise, I would say, in maybe unexpected places. So I just mentioned three of them, very synthetically. First, in some still non-edited manuscripts, but very important manuscripts, Husserl's manuscript about the Struktur des Bewusstseins, the structures of consciousness, which belong to the last manuscripts which will be edited right now. So, for example, this manuscript entitled Gefühl, feeling, we have, and in other places as well, but here we have in the framework of very basic bodily tendencies and drives, surprise occurs as a bodily reaction of resistance to an alluring novelty. So it's a very, primitive phenomenon, primitive process that is here at work, very organic, lived organic process, I would say. We also have I would say at perceptive level, so something that's a bit higher level, in some other manuscripts, much well-known, more well-known manuscripts, Experience and Judgment, or the analysis of passive synthesis, only translated into English. So affection is surprise is associated with the effect of a contrast which appears in perceptive activity where that's where it doesn't correspond to what was expected. I mean, you have a kind of awaiting horizon, general awaiting horizon, and something happens that doesn't meet your expectations. Well, there are many examples of Husserl about this phenomenon. So, and then for Husserl, that's what we are talking about just right now. That for Husserl, this this contrast with expectations or discrepancy with what was expected is called disappointment. So, well, that's an interesting hint at what we had in the psychological context. That's the way Husserl will name surprise, in a sense. He will not use the word surprise. He will use disappointment as the negative polarity of what's happening that doesn't meet my expectations. And that's at the perceptive level. So it's a more conscious level, I would say, than the first one, which is quite pre-conscious and organic. And then I would also have a third entry, I would say, into surprise at a still more complex level, which has to do with the gnoseological interest. And it has to do with it's within the dynamic of attention, which is the process of being stricken by something that I didn't notice first. Surprise may appear in a twofold way. It's at the same time it's what strikes me, what becomes salient, as something like in German Abgehobenheit, something that occurs, that becomes acquires some relief. So that's the objective side of surprise, and at the same time it's also what's a kind of releasing as a just after phase of this striking moment, and that's more the subjective side of surprise. And so this release moment, Entspannung, is something that retains a kind of emotional aspect, which is not necessarily present in the striking aspect. So there is this kind of twofold phenomenon, both objective and subjective. The objective one being not emotional, the subjective one entailing a kind of emotional component through the releasing moment, which may be negative or positive. I mean, it may be a release in the sense of being disappointed, but it may be positive in the sense of being satisfied. So depending on what happens, I mean, the kind of experience, then you will have this kind of polarity. So well, even though Husserl never thematized surprise, we have many analyses where we could sketch a kind of phenomenology of surprise in Husserl. So, well, I think it's quite interesting. Well, I will go very quickly into these. Actually, maybe I won't go into them. And it's probably too quick. So, if you are a specialist in Schiller, Heidegger, and Sartre, we will not agree. So you will find places as in the same way as what I did with Husserl, trying to find out surprise, even if it's not thematized. You might find also surprise in these different philosophers, even if it's not thematized. So I will go very quickly, and I won't develop that. My conclusion, which is for me more important, is that in these phenomenologies, which are phenomenology where emotion is at work in a very manifest way in Schiller, but also in Sartre, in the early Sartre, more difficultly in Heidegger, but still with Stimmungen. So in these different phenomenologies, and also in Husserl actually, surprise needs actually to be reconstructed through other themes and concepts. So it's not a direct theme, it's not a direct topic. And so that's, I mean, that's really the difficulty we have with phenomenologies here, even if there are phenomenologies of emotions, they are not bringing surprise to the fore. So that's a question. So, and it's a contrast with what psychologists and early philosophers tend to advocate as being quite obvious. So it doesn't seem to be so obvious that surprise is an emotion, since it's not included in these phenomenologies of emotion. But that's the point I wanted to make here. So, well, what we could keep still from this difficulty is that surprise may appear still as something that has to do with a gnosiological or ontological effect, which is not emotion in a sense. It's important to make the difference. And here we may have, along some very small analysis in Husserl, different aspects of this gnosiological or ontological effect. I am affected by the noise of a siren, which triggers my noticing it, or I'm afraid of a friend, and he finally doesn't come up, and it generates disappointment. So, or my bodily and inner tension is released at these moments of rupture of the ongoing tension. So surprise seems to be the contrast inherent in a lived bodily cognitive dynamic. So if we conclude that it doesn't seem to map something that's emotional in the primary sense, at least. And we have some agreements or allies or from from ancient and modern philosophers on this issue, which help us conclude that surprise does not belong, so it seems, to emotional acts, and so orient us into more cognitive aspects, cognitive dynamic. Aristotle in his Poetics brings these two, I would say now in an interpretative way, cognitive names of surprise through Thomazein, or also in Plato, of course, as being the triggering source of knowledge. So for Aristotle and Plato, surprise is astonishment. So it has a very strong cognitive dimension. And also in this, another name is eplecticon, which is the immediate effect produced by Thomazein on an audience, so in a theater or play. So surprise is literally the stroke, plague. So it's what strikes, what produces a shock, what then generates attention. So it really has to do with, I would say, with body and cognition and cognitive process, and not with emotion, so it seems here. And we also have some confirmations of this in other traditions, philosophical tradition, empiricism, and philosophy of mind today. So authors, I won't go into them right now, but authors like Adam Smith or Peirce or Davidson or Dennett, more contemporarily, they all go into this idea that surprise is what we would say today a cognitive emotion. That's a very difficult word because well, it doesn't mean anything. It's difficult to, but well, that's the way they call it. For me, surprise would not be in this sense an emotion, but it would more be a it's being part of this kind of becoming aware of a discrepancy between what I thought or believed and what is actually. So that's the contrast moment or the discrepancy moment. And it reveals a kind of non-coincidence between two states of knowledge. It indicates then the necessity of coping with the situation or adjusting to it. So this is typical of, in all these analysis of these different philosophers, we find this kind of same process, understanding of surprise. So then the idea is to conclude from this that maybe surprise includes, or it's obvious that surprise includes, of course, an emotional component, but that it's a more encompassing phenomenon, which is irreducible to emotion as such. And so in this, on this matter, it's interesting that that's the work we are just trying to do now in this project, to find out invariants of this complexity. At the moment, maybe we have these 5 invariants. So I mentioned authors which may be indications of this possibility to analyze time, lived body, cognition, language, and affect as being invariants or components of what surprise is. So, for example, well, I already mentioned for time the temporal dynamics. Let's appear that surprise is the moment of rupture, of interruption in the general temporal process. So it can be then contextualized with the emotional contents, but as such, it's not necessary to add this emotional content. Or, well, that's a question. Is it intrinsic to the process of rupture to include this emotional content or not? That might be a question we could well discuss then, actually. And also then we have different other components which are of course operating in surprise. The bodily reactions, which are quite corresponding to this rupture, to this interruption moment. Well, we have very interesting physiological data, but also very lived bodily aspects which occur when you're surprised, and it's also mapping with language in this issue, because the language is also body language, bodily anchored language, with exclamations and interjections, or something that is quite bodily anchored. So, well, that will be dealt more by our linguistic colleagues. Well, I won't go further in this. So now I would like to go into my second step, and introduce this term, valence, in order to try to, as a kind of exploratory concept, even if it's quite well known in psychology, this valence term, but an exploratory concept in a phenomenological investigation, on the phenomenological level. I mean, approach, valence is not used usually, so it's reserved to psychology. So I want to introduce it, to put it in this phenomenological context, try to see what it makes if you put valence in a phenomenological approach. And my idea is it's an interesting concept because it's a twofold dynamic concept, and it because it includes let's say it includes something that has to do with a lived experience, so a first-person experience, and it also has to do with a third-person aspect, so something that's not directly linked to my subjective experience. So I would like to, well, I will try to show you why it's interesting to try to put it in the framework. So just to introduce this issue, so I will go into these different aspects. So the three emotional micro phases within the temporal dynamics of surprise, and then well, valence being a very broad concept, which is both physiologically anchored and potentially ethically dimensioned, and then, well, the remaining complex relations between valence, surprise, and emotion. And then why it could be interesting to use valence as a generic category for the very emotional appearing of surprise. So the idea of this first point is to show how surprise being a temporarily embedded dynamics, we have different phases of this dynamics, and in these different phases, in the three main phases, emotion may appear as a component. So I'm following the idea that surprise includes an emotion, a component, emotional component, but is not reducible to it. But if you try to go further in this issue, what happens if you look closer at the very dynamic? So we have these three phases: an awaiting phase. So what Husserl already called the awaiting horizon, or the pretension in a tinier meaning. So the awaiting phase, and in this awaiting phase, emotion may appear under the word tension, as a generic process. And then if you try to see it in terms of valence, it may appear either as hope or as anxiety. So it may be polarized then. You may add this emotional content to the generic tension process. In the aftermath phase, so after, I would say, the rupture moment, then you have another appearing of emotion as release, and then in terms of valence, it may become either satisfaction or disappointment, or I don't know if the word relievance exists in English, but relief, you would say, okay. So we could understand then the emotional content linked to the more generic process of release, and then the question, that's also a question I would like to maybe to discuss with you, is to ask whether is there a similar emotional dimension during the what we call the crisis phase, or the rupture phase, or the rupture moment, interruption. And well, the idea is, well, the hypothesis would be that emotion here is appearing as a blank, something that has no content, no specific content in the very rupture moment. And that emotion appears either just before, in the pretensional phase or tension, and just after as an immediate aftermath effect. But at the very moment of the rupture, of the shock, or the crisis, there is no emotional content, and emotion is then neutralized. So that's an hypothesis, and it would need to be discussed more, of course. And what appears at this rupture moment has more to do with the bodily movements, so and the body language. So the rupture moment is expressed bodily and in language, or not, but there might be a silence, but it's also a language embedded in a sense. But the proper emotional content is not operating there. It's operating just before or just after, in this very tiny dynamics of time we have in Husserl between pretension and after the aftermath phase. Then you have emotion. And of course, for Husserl, this is what Husserl calls the living present. So for Husserl, of course, if you collapse it into what we call living present, of course emotion will be operating just before and just after. But at the rupture moment, the question is, well, my question is there emotion there? So, and now, given that, I I would introduce valence as a way to look closer into these two phases, just before, just after, and to show the structure of the polarity of emotions at at these two phases. Well, just and some backgrounds on this word valence. So, well, the origin of the term in Kurt Lewin, who is a psychologist influenced by or dealing with Gestalt holism, and so that's well known. Here, valence is the dynamics of opposite forces, attractive, aversive, in a context structured by the learning by a learning process, where you may develop your possibilities, your abilities, while coping with these conflicted dynamics. So in Lewin, you have this very broad understanding of valence, which is also behavioral and psychological and contextualized. So it was then very much used in psychology with this dynamic polarity between attractiveness and aversiveness. And so then you, by extension, it also characterizes specific emotions. But you see here, it's an extension. So it's valence itself is maybe understood with these emotional contents, polarized emotional contents. But you may also understand it as a structural dynamics. Adding these emotions then to the process. But the question is it really intrinsic to the dynamics or not? So you may then have anger or fear as negative, embodying negative valence, and joy, and on the contrary, joy as embodying positive valence. And then so it's the idea is to understand valence as this structural polar dynamics, which goes from physiology, bodily and behavioral, to potentially to ethics through norms, valuing, and ambivalence. So I find this concept quite interesting because it's a very encompassing concept. And also it opens the way to this structural dynamics. Well, the difficulty is that there are still complex relations between these three terms: valence, surprise, and emotion. One common point to start with would be to go into to claim this strong relation between valence and surprise would be to say that they both include this negative positive polarity. So that's a starting common point. And in that aspect, surprise is not valence as such, but may have any valence. So it can be neutral, moderate, pleasant, unpleasant. And in that sense, we could have a strong claim saying that valence then is inherent in surprise, something that is operating and active in surprise as a very inner component. But we have still other understandings or counter hypotheses in the theoretical discussion. For example, Casati, in a recent article in Phenomenology and Cognitive Sciences, who would say that surprise being characterized, well, as we have seen, as a short-lasting and more or less basic emotion, has no definite positive or negative value. So he would take the opposite stance. He would say that since it is essentially embodied, bodily anchored, and as a cognitive process understood, then it has no specific valence. It's something, surprise would be transversal to valence, but not inherently constituted by valence. So, I mean, these two hypotheses for me are difficult to, it remains open, I would say, because it's difficult to have a clear understanding of whether the one is true or not. I mean, both may be said, and it's difficult to. And it's the reason why, because of this possible absence of valence, it's also a way to exclude surprise as from the list of emotions. So, well, the argument is then to say that since surprise is transversal to valence, or is a structure that may be neutral, or may then include subsequently valence as negative or positive, then it's not an emotion. But you could say the reverse. You could say that valence is actually transversal. I mean, is really the structure, the very structure of surprise. So I would be inclined to go in this direction rather than what is stated here by Cassetti and other philosophers. But that's an issue that may be also discussed, I would say. And what I will then keep from this whole discussion, is that valence may be in this twofold mode of appearing, positive, negative, dynamical, may be an interesting operative concept to use. In these two phases, just before and just after. So the argument for that is what I said already. So valence is intrinsically bipolarized. And another argument is that there is a strong argument is that there is no neutral surprise, except maybe in the very crisis phase, where body and language and cognition are dominant, and where there would be then a kind of blank of emotion. And the other argument would be that emotion appears sooner as tension or waiting, and later in the aftermath effect. And then here it is intrinsically valence laden, that is polarized with this hope, anxiety, or marvel or disappointment. So that would be the idea. And now I go to my conclusive step. So to come back to what we obtained already, it seems that with surprise we are confronted, according to what we saw, to two kinds of biases. First, this kind of taken for granted equivalence between surprise and emotion in psychology, experimental psychology, and on the contrary, a kind of lateral or partial access to surprise in phenomenology. So the necessity to provide a kind of reconstruction of the phenomenon of surprise thanks to other structural categories. So we have these two difficulties. I would say there are kind of mirror difficulties in psychology, because it's so obvious that it's not questioned, and in phenomenology that it's so absent that it's difficult to describe or to thematize, I would say. So we have this state of difficulties, so the idea is to try to provide a refined descriptive phenomenology of surprise, thanks to these dynamics, including valence and these three microphases. In order to go forward in this direction, I would say that we need, and that's also our project, an ongoing project, we need to look closer at what physiology tells us about surprise, as we will see, as a startle and as cardiac defense, And that will provide us with third-person indications, and in this issue also relevant descriptions about this bodily cognitive process of surprise. So that's an important, I would say, underground for this refined, I would say, descriptive phenomenology. And as a counterpart, we also need a more experiential approach of phenomenology, so not only theoretical or textual, in order to find out more appropriate micro subcategories of surprise, and not only, I would say, a priori macro categories, which are indirect and can only be used, I would say, as a kind of general framework to go into. And so in this issue, this more experiential phenomenology needs to focus on a very situated first-person experience and a description of it, a description of a very singularized situation, moment of surprise, and not as a general phenomenon. And therefore, well, I won't develop that here, but therefore the interest of the use of a technique in psychology, in introspective psychology, which is called elicitation interviews, which are used to provide a very singular description of a precise moment, a very situated moment. And then the idea, of course, is to bring a comparison between the very a priori categories we have in phenomenological philosophical phenomenology, and these very experiential categories which emerge directly from the description of a singular experience, situated experience. And we also need, of course, on this matter to have a very close study of what occurs on these descriptive level. So what is expressed by the subjects of their surprising moment, what happens here, and how they describe it. So hence the need for also a complementary study of this of the linguistic dimension of the verbalization of this description. So then the question is why cardio and not neurophenomenology? What seems to me is that there are I mean, in looking back on what was Varela's thrust with neurophenomenology. Some 15 years ago already. What appears is that Varela's thrust with neurophenomenology situates the correlation or the generation of these neuro and phenomenological aspects on two very discontinuous levels. The first level for him was actually the phenomenological analysis, but in the sense of a theoretical philosophical analysis, so providing macro structural categories. So we have to do with a priori phenomenological categories on the one side, and on the other side the neurodynamics he was looking at and analyzing is clearly subpersonal. So he provided then in his analysis of time, for example, he provided phase categories, but which are clearly subpersonal. So non-perceived or non-perceivable by a subject. So with these two discontinuous levels, it's quite difficult to to articulate the levels, because they're too far from each other. One is very conceptual and structural. The other one is quite subpersonal. So the idea of cardio-phenomenology is to find out mediations between these two levels, and so to try to confirm or to go further into this hypothesis of generative constraints between lived categories and experimental categories, but to I would say to restore a continuity of analysis and to find more active correlations. So the idea is to reduce, I would say, the discrepancy or the discontinuity between these two levels, a priori transcendental and neurodynamic, which are obviously too far away one from the other to be correlated, and to try to find more continuous experiential levels on both sides, third person side, first person side. Well, in order to try to claim this relevance of cardio-phenomenology, well, I just quoted this Dennett's sentence, because I found it quite interesting in his own way. He goes into this idea that it's a very easy phenomenon to measure, and very easy to very immediate phenomenon also to experience. So it has two sides. I mean, a very interesting and very very simple measurable phenomenon, and very also immediate first-person phenomenon. And in this, and therefore, surprise may appear as a good indicator of this possible continuity between third-person and first-person approaches, in the sense that if you look at the physiological aspect and description of surprise, then you will you will find this idea of a bodily startle as a bodily cardiac reaction, which is pre-conscious but accessible to consciousness, and at the same time it's also very easily measurable. So so you may find continuity there. And it offers a strong continuity also in the phases between an experiential, implicit, anticipatory, and an aftermath resonance continuity. So it's clearly closer to consciousness as being pre-conscious and not subconscious, like in the third-person brain dynamics. And in the same way, on the first-person side, it's also a pre-conscious first-person lived experience, quite immediate to describe and to come back to. And so in that context, it enables a very narrow continuity with physiological aspects, and it resonates very strongly with also an expressive bodily language. So it seems that it's to conclude, maybe through surprise it's possible to find out experiential mediations, and to well, to try to integrate different aspects, well, to bring philosophy into a first-person experiencing, and to see in psychophysiology a way to go more concretely into the third-person aspect, more concretely than neurodynamics. With the, well, I can directly access to a first-person experience of surprise I can quasi-spontaneously feel my heart beating, not neurons. And we, of course, with the physiological dynamics, we have maybe a not so subtle timing as than on the neurological dynamics, but it's more easily mappable with the lived subjective maybe growth timing. So it's a way to put closer, I mean, two levels which are situated on a very narrow interface. And on this issue, the idea of cardio-phenomenology would be to, in the sense, to put the heart at the center of this twofold continuity, because the heart is at the same time a center of lived affection. So it's a first-person experience, and it's a physiological pre-conscious experience. So on the third-person side, it's also operating in a strong continuity. So, well, that's the idea of this hypothesis of cardio-phenomenology. Well, I think it's it's okay. So thank you very much.
Okay, we have time for just a little bit of discussion, and then we'll take a little break and then move on. I'll kind of moderate, so the others please do.
And Natalie, thank you for this interesting talk. I want to make sure I sort of understand what I think you're putting forward. And two questions. One is just sort of informational. You probably said it, but I don't think I picked it up. When you say that, what should we call it, the present moment as opposed to the protension, the retention, in that instant, there is not emotion. What is this definition of emotion? That's question one, in the sense in which there isn't emotion, because is it just that there isn't valence? Or, so let me say the second. The second question is, on a Husserlian account of time, temporality, there isn't a present instant separate from protension and retention.
Of course.
In William James's phrase, the present moment is a saddleback and not a knife edge, which I think makes the same Husserlian point. So, how could it be that if there is emotion in the protension and the retention, that there isn't some sense in which that also imbues the present instant? So the first question is about defining what you mean by emotion, and the second is how this relates to a Husserlian account of time.
Yeah, it's a crucial question. What could I say? How could I say it? I agree with you, of course, that for Husserl, both protensional and retentional aspects are inherently linked into the very present moment. So that the very extension, a more of a lived extension of present, includes this just after and just before moments or phases. Of course, and so we could stay there, and we can say, since the lived present includes these two, as a dynamic, these two micro phases of just before, just after, and it's part of the whole present moment, then emotion is, of course, at work, precisely because it's operating in the protensional and in the retentional moment. So we could close the question this way. If we remained at, I would say, at the theoretical level of Husserl's phenomenology, is interesting for me is to, I would say, to displace the issue on a more experiential level, using resources from experimental and physiological description, and also bringing them into a more concrete way of describing what actually occurs. And so using also descriptions from persons who referred to a very singularized moment of surprise. So if you go into this other level of phenomenological description, then Husserl's framework is of course quite operating, but it's not sufficient. And you discover a very refined way to describe these different phases. So you keep the general framework, but then you...
But that seems to be contradicting Husserl, unless I'm misunderstanding it. It seems like a refutation of Husserl then.
It's not, for me, it's not a refutation.
Or else a decision to just ignore what Husserl said.
No, because I think that the general dynamics is quite relevant. What Husserl meant with living present remains quite operating. It's quite relevant, but it needs to be described more finely. And then the problems occur, because if you go more finely into what actually operates in pretension, when somebody is, I mean, when you discover, you look at something and it suddenly appears to you as not being what you had meant it would be. Well, I'm speaking in a generic way, so it's not very coherent. But if you look in a very singularized experience, then you can both, I would say, validate Husserl's macro analysis and also ask for more subtle distinctions into the continuity of this process. And then you can ask Husserl questions about what's actually operating at the very moment when you have this kind of rupture of what happens for me. Is this rupture actually something that includes emotion, or is the emotion coming actually just after? We speak very correctly of a surprise effect.
What's the emotion then? My other question. What's the definition of, what's the essential feature of emotion?
Emotion would be the weight. I mean, the weight is describable in a kind of polarization, either negative or positive.
In what?
Either negative or positive. The weight is it is then operating as a content.
Positive or negative valence.
Yeah.
Good or bad.
Yeah. And therefore, at the very moment of the rupture, well, the question is there any kind of emotion in this sense, in this meaning? And it's not so obvious that there is. Whereas it seems to be that in the awaiting phase there is an emotional valence, and in the after phase as well.
Could there be a mixture, an ambiguous mixture of good and bad?
Yeah, but then for me it's too simple as a solution to say that it's mixed. For me it's very important to try to go further and to really discriminate what's already occurring at these very different moments.
Just a couple of things. I have a lot of sympathy for what you're trying to do. So I really just have some thoughts in the way of suggestions. Mm-hmm. So with regard to phenomenology, I think it's interesting that there is no sophisticated, specific, or reserved discussion of surprise among the major figures. On the other hand, it's just as interesting, or maybe all the more interesting, that actually surprise plays a strategic methodological role in the phenomenologists after Husserl. I mean, it's surprise that works the reduction in Heidegger when the hammer breaks.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's surprise that works the reduction in Heidegger in Levinas when the face of the other mm-hmm. turns towards me. I think Sartre is an interesting case. He's in between. So, mm-hmm. and I like Sartre for that reason. I'm prompted to reflection when it dawns on me that Pierre does not turn up at the cafe, although we had an agreement. Right? So I think there's something to think about there. But I hear all of that and the difficulty at that level, or the peculiarity of that gap at the methodological level, to be involved with a struggle with Cartesianism and phenomenology. It's very interesting that the method is driven, that the method that tries to overcome Descartes takes an account of surprise that obeys Cartesian temporality. You know, you went to the examples over and over again. It's instantaneous, it's interruptive. I find that phenomenologically very, very impoverished to reduce surprise to all of that. So I think there's something to think about there, and I think we were getting at it on the concrete with this kind of question as well. Don't we have an overly discrete account of temporalization if we're not careful? So, you know, that's just my first thought. I see a problem, and I think I see that you see a problem. Maybe there's something to think about there. The other is much simpler, and it has to do with the references you made towards the end to tension and emotion. This reminds me that the full experience of surprise involves catharsis, right? It calls for language, and it's not finished until you erupt, either in gasp or shout, or you give it words. I wouldn't leave consultation. I would consult tragedy, Nietzsche, Freud, people like that, as we try to work through this side of the experience of surprise.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was very much interested in what I read in Aristotle on this issue, because it really it gives a very pregnant description of this kind of how did you say? Well, the catharsis, but the link, the coupling link with the striking moments. I mean,
well, and the other thing about tragedy, I don't remember if Aristotle talks about it. He probably does. You know, the surprise, the turn in tragedy that shocks us and horrifies us. It dawns on you slowly. It doesn't happen all at once. So the temporality of surprise.
There is the kind of what we call a peripacy.
That's right.
Peripacy, So the turning point, which is prepared before, and we'll get into some effects afterwards. So that's a very interesting model. I discovered it while preparing, so I thought, well, I have to include that in order to give also a contextual understanding of this issue, of these dynamics.